Now with whole child education, once you've nailed down how you're going to approach social emotional learning, and you start looking at this ring of academic expertise areas, the first one that you're going to want to start with is standards and grading. By far, the most important to start with is standards and grading, understanding that maybe you're not going to use the Common Core state standards, maybe you're going to use a different set, a different state, a different country. Whatever your standards are, you have to be clear on not only what your grade or your age range is looking at, but how does it fit in the development? Because we're all about growth rather than proficiency. It's not a matter of are you here, but rather where are you in the spectrum so that we can support that. Grading is equally important and is part of the same conversation, because how you determine whether a child is at that point of proficiency, or rather that point of growth and development, you have to be clear on what you're grading and why. How does the grading communicate that that's where they are in that progression for that skill? So as we go into standards and grading, a little bit of history. The standards began as a reaction to a 1983 report, and in the 1990s, the states all began to develop their own set of standards. Proficient was not part of these conversations nationally. They were given to each state to define on their own as part of their own state standards. 2007, 10 years after the states all adopted them, 2007, a report was released with data from an assessment that showed that all of these different states with all of their different standards ended up with all of these different results. The standards with higher expectations in their standards had a lower high school graduation rate because it was harder to graduate. States with lower expectations and standards had a higher graduation rate because it was easier to graduate. The problem, though, is the lower expectations with higher graduation rates had a lot more high school graduates that were not ready for the global workforce. And the number of students that were being graduated, it was a smaller number of them. And it was actually doing damage to a lot of otherwise potentially qualified candidates. So 2010, the governors of nearly all of the states agreed to adopt a new set of baseline standards called the Common Core. And from 2010 to 2015, publishing companies, state assessment people, they all scrambled to try and put together the resources to meet these new standards for all of these different states. It was an unfortunate rollout of an incredibly brilliant plan. And in 2017 and into this year, 2018, a few states have removed the standards, the Common Core standards, but they've only removed the name. And if you look at those state standards, the actual text has remained the same. So the expectations are still challenging. And teachers will agree across the country that rigorous standards are wanted. But it's exactly what those standards say and where they fit in the grade level progression is where a lot of people will disagree. So, with that said, exploring the core, we here at Exploring the Core believe that standards are guidelines. They're not actually the things you should be assessing. It's the learning targets that are the tasks that you need to assess and grade. So if you look at a standard like in second grade language arts, you have main idea and key details. So language arts, reading, literature, grade 2, standard 2. The main idea and key details, you need to be able to recount a story and determine the central message. That's essentially what you're asking a second grader to do. Well, maybe in order to assess or grade a student's ability to do that, maybe your level 1 learning target is to identify from a list of possible options. Is it this or is it this? it's a pretty low-level cognitive task that you're asking them to do to prove that they can do this. Or, as a level 2, that's a little deeper, maybe you actually have them describe the central message, referring to the general ideas of the story. That takes a little more thought, a little more cognitive rigor. So it's a level 2. Now, when you're grading, you have to take into consideration, what are you having them do, and how are you going to communicate the growth of that particular level of skill to the student or to the student's parents. So when you're talking about communicating growth, are you talking about pass or fail? Are you talking about a percentage or a letter grade? What is the best way to communicate growth of a particular skill? Now there's a lot of contention here because there's all of these different ways to show growth as a grading scale. One thing I want to make sure that we all understand is none of these scales can be interchangeable. The percentage scale is different than the 4-point scale. Because in the percentage scale, you have things where if you have 10 questions and they get 7 right, then they got 70%. And for a lot of schools, 70% is passing. Well, the problem is some tests have 7 questions. And if they get 5 of them right, they pass. And if they get 4 of them right, they fail. So the problem with percentages is when you're talking about growth, one question on that test can be the difference between passing or failing. When you're looking at letter grades, a lot of people will conflate percentages with letter grades. They'll say an A is 100% because they got all of the problems right. Well, if all of the problems are at a proficient level and none of the problems are advanced in any way, then that 100% should mean that they are proficient, not advanced. So that A means you learned everything you're supposed to learn because you got 100% of the questions right. And yet the same problems still exist because people conflate the two all the time. A 57% is an F, a 71% is a C, and out of 7 questions, that's the difference of 1 missed question. A 4-point scale is very popular, but again, it doesn't explain the difference between a 3 and a 4, an 80% and a 100%. And if there are no advanced questions, then that 4 is actually proficient, not advanced. The pass-fail, credit-no credit, it doesn't communicate whether or not they learned everything. If they missed something, did they still pass? And do they require 100% in order to pass? And if not, how do you communicate the part that they didn't get? So communication of growth, that's what grading is intended to be. When you're looking at standards, another really important part of this conversation is understanding that a standard in one grade is going to connect to a standard in another grade and connects to the next grade level. There is a clear development in any of the standards that are developed in any state. And when you look at main ID in first grade and connect it to main ID in the second and connect it to main ID in third, there is a clear connection where the same skill is being assessed and taught, where you're retelling stories, you're recounting the story, the verb is still the same. You hear a story, you read a story, tell me the story. But then in first grade, you only have to demonstrate understanding of a central message. And that could be as simple as agreeing. Whereas in second grade, your job is to determine the central message. And that can look different than just demonstrating an understanding. Whereas in third grade, you not only have to determine, but you must explain how that central message is conveyed with key details. That's evidence. So when you look at possible learning tasks these are the things you're going to grade. Can they do this? Retell and maybe agree with me. Can they do it? How well can they do it? The grading scale you choose is ultimately going to get you here. If they can do that, and you have time, maybe that student is ready to retell the story and include the lesson or the moral, but doing it on their own. That I would consider a level 2 learning target. Well, in second grade, you'll notice that there's some overlap of the learning targets. So with a second grade text being the key difference, identifying from a provided list of possible answers is different than, do you agree that this is the central message or not? 50-50. Now you have a list where you have to decide what the message is. And again, level 2, if they can retell the story and tell you the main idea of the story, great. That's where we want them to be, right? In third grade, if you have them identify the main idea from a list, it's very, very similar to these other low-level cognitive rigor, and maybe that's where they are. But that's not the standard anymore, is it? They can do that with the third grade text, but that's showing growth, isn't it? And level 2 is describing the main idea of a third grade text. But third grade is the first time where you're now expecting them to do a level 3, where they are explaining the main idea of a story and supporting it with key details. That takes some strategic thinking and reasoning in order to organize those thoughts to present the main idea and say, I know this is the main idea because in the text it says this, this, and this. That sort of strategic thinking may be possible with some second grader students and maybe a few first grade students with those first and second grade texts. And if so, you need to be able to understand that this level 3 target could be made available to those second grade students or even those first grade students with those texts if they're able to get to level 2 and describe it on their own. So every child is different, and the teacher needs to understand the development of these standards and the learning targets that represent the depth of understanding, the depth of proficiency, so that their grading is communicating something very specific. There are tools made available, language arts and math, that show how all of these different progressions exist, how all of these learning targets move from one grade to the next, and it is available on iOS and Android. Exploring the Core, Math K5, Language Arts K8, and new this year are math posters for classrooms that illustrate all of the math from 6th to 7th to 8th and how every skill progresses, targeting each standard across grade levels. So, standards and grading is one conversation that needs to be discussed in any school or homeschool as part of an approach to whole child education, noting the heart is still social emotional learning.